Okay, so we might kick off with just a couple of minutes past 3. So welcome everyone to Feeling the Pulse for September. My name is Eloise Telford, and I'm part of the Community Housing Futures Program Delivery Team alongside Murray Benton, who you see on the screen. So these monthly sessions, if you've been along before, you'll know it's a regular learning exchange for community housing providers, focusing on investment and growth activities. We're always open to suggestions of topics. So we've got a couple more sessions for the year. Please feel free to let us know if there's anything you'd like to hear about. In terms of housekeeping, this session's being recorded for distribution purposes. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Murray's moderating that one, and we can either interrupt Andrew or bring them forward during the Q&A at the end. And we also love seeing faces and engaging with you. So if you can put on your camera, we'd love to see all your smiling faces. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of all the various lands in which we're dialing in from today. I'm here in Meanjin or Megadjin. I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people, extend my respect to elders past and present, extend that respect to any First Nations people here with us today. Feel free to pop your location in the chat function so we know where you're joining from today. And as always, I'd like to acknowledge our 3 peaks who govern our program, Community Housing Futures. So that's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Queensland, led by Neil Wilmot, Community Housing Industry Association led by Anne-Marie Callender, and our Auspice Q Shelter, led by Fiona Knigler. We don't have too many program updates this month, but we'd really like to highlight a few opportunities that are there for community housing providers at the moment. The first one is that Arup is seeking expressions of interest to partner on pro bono technical project support for any tier 3s. So Arup have a lot of experience with sustainable development, and they have worked with women's shelters in the past. I'd like to extend more of this pro bono work. All of these opportunities are on our website, so you can find out more. We also have Ingenia looking at partnering with a community housing provider to be able to take advantage of some of the initiatives being offered by local, state, and federal councils and government at the moment. And lastly, Project Net Zero. So they're 100% Indigenous owned social enterprise, and they complete DFITs for corporates and hotels and end up with a lot of furniture. And this is something that community housing providers can access for free. So a few opportunities there, more information on our website if you're interested, or feel free to reach out to Murray and I to get in touch.
I've also just thrown that link to our opportunities part of the website in the chat too, El.
Thanks so much, Murray. It's great. And so, so this month we're focusing on the unique challenges faced in the rural and regional community housing sector. So you might have seen Ahuri has released a report called Disruption in Regional Housing, Policy Responses for More Resilient Markets. And Professor Andrew Beer was the lead author in that. We're really lucky to have Andrew with us today to dive a bit more deeply into that. Professor Andrew Beer is Executive Dean of Uni SA Business. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Adelaide and a PhD from Australian National University. He was the chair of the South Australian Government Homelessness Strategic Group from 2011 to 2017 as a fellow of the Regional Australia Institute. So thank you so much, Andrew, for coming to speak with us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Eloise, and many thanks to everyone for the invitation to come and speak today. Before I start, I'll acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I also acknowledge the ongoing relationship between the Kaurna and this land on which I'm speaking today. I'm going to share some slides with you, and some of which, can you confirm that they're working? The share slides?
Yep, all good.
Thank you very much. And some of which is drawn from the study that Eloise referred to in her opening remarks, and some of which comes from other work I've done over the last 20 or so years looking at housing in regional Australia. And I was asked to consider a number of issues and also reflect upon sort of policy responses. So that's broadly the agenda I'll be following today. So I guess one of the first things that we often do in Australia is we look to international models. No, just going to get it to progress now.
Technology, Andrew, it's always the way just when you start getting your momentum too.
Yeah.
We're happy to just wait. Feel free to.
Thank you very much.
There is a next option there when you're clicking, Andrew.
Yeah, it finally works. It's just a bit hard enough. So in Australia, we often look at international models, and if you've ever worked in Australian housing policy, you know that a lot of what we try and do is actually reflective of what new ideas are emerging out of other parts of the world, particularly the US and the UK, but also looking at some other jurisdictions, including those in Europe. And if you paid attention to news broadcasts last night, you'll notice that there's a brouhaha happening in the Senate where the Australian government, the Albanese government, is trying to introduce legislation which gives them subsidies to private developers to provide affordable housing. That policy setting looks very similar to the federal government the federal government policy agenda in the US, where they've had low-income tax credit housing for quite some time. So policy transfer happens all the time. But one of the problems when we look at Australia is that there are very few countries that really like Australia. Probably the greatest comparator we have is Canada, but to be honest, Canada is also a large resource-dependent country with a colonial heritage, but their housing policy in some ways is as bad as our own. And if you're looking internationally, the one that I have looked at over time is really the policy settings that come out of the northern region of Europe, which is covered by a think tank called Nordregio. And they've got a lot of really interesting ideas. So it's Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and the Faroe Islands. So if you look at them collectively, there are relatively small nations by population size. Some of them have very large areas, as we do in Australia. So the northern parts of Norway, the northern parts of Finland, and the northern parts of Sweden are largely empty of people. They have problems with remoteness. They have prosperous economies. They are democratic nations, and they also have a history of policy experimentation. The big difference between these nations and Australia, of course, is they have much bigger governments relative to the size of their economy. So if you think about Australia, for every $1 government taxes and has available to spend in Australia, the Danish government has $1.50. And that, of course, makes an enormous difference in terms of what you can do with your government interventions in the economy and government actions. So just bear that in mind, because often these northern European nations have policy options that would either not be politically acceptable in Australia or simply be on the budget envelope of the Australian governments. Northern Europe has had a big focus on regional housing for a number of reasons. And those reasons are very similar to what we find when we go out to regional Australia and look at their housing. So they've got very low population density. They've got many regions that are suffering from population loss. They have essentially frozen housing markets. Similarly, if you drive around Australia's regional housing, Australia's country towns, you see many places where a new dwelling hasn't been built in maybe 30 years. They have the same problem. They also have high construction costs, and they also see their young people departing, which just adds to the ageing of their population all the time. So they have many of the same problems that we have, but they have a different set of approaches to responding. And in large measure, all of the governments referred to here have actually taken action on regional housing or rural housing questions. So in Sweden, the government has gone so far as to guarantee house prices. One of the problems of buying a home in a country town in Australia is the price falls and your asset deteriorates in values and you're locked in. You can no longer withdraw your equity and move somewhere else. That's a significant impediment to you investing in that property, but it's also a significant impediment to banks lending you money to buy a property in that region. In Sweden, they deal with that issue through a government guarantee. They also, in Sweden, provide capital grants for the construction and demolition of housing in stagnant markets. So in places where there could be seen to be excess housing, where there's too much housing because population has fallen, and Whyalla in South Australia used to be a good example of that, vacant stock reduces the value and the price of existing occupied stock. So you deal with that by bulldozing that stock, and then you build new stock, which is more fit for purpose. In Norway, and of course these governments will take their own approach, there's been direct provision of older persons housing and also central government subsidies to local government to build housing. So Norway, like many of these nations, is a unitary system of government. It's not a federation. There's the Norwegian government, then there's municipal governments. And they realise that one of the biggest problems, they have many older people living in their communities, often in very poor conditions as their housing is deteriorated. So their solution is actually to build more housing for older people. That in turn frees up stock for younger people to move in with a lifestyle emphasis. And also they've had central government fund local governments to actually build housing. So in many of these nations, the equivalent of state government providing housing here is local government providing housing because there's no state governments. So there's been direct investment by the Norwegian government, noting, of course, that Norway is very wealthy on the back of its oil resources. In Denmark, they've been confronted by similar problems, and their solution has been to regulate short stay accommodation in terms of putting restrictions on Airbnb stays and other providers. And they've also regulated holiday homes. So if you own a holiday home in Denmark, you have to live in it for 180 days in a year. That's clearly not the case in Australia. So if we were to think about Nordic approaches, what would we think about? What would be the potential pathways that could be followed? So one would be restrictions or taxes on Airbnb and holiday homes. Now, Victoria has gone partly down this track, and around Australia, some local governments have sought to regulate Airbnb style accommodation, usually to quite patchy outcomes. Because what you'll often do is if you ban Airbnb from Byron Bay, it just goes further up the coast or further south along the coast. It also can generate very significant pushback from taxpayers. So in Margaret River in Western Australia, they imposed an additional rate tax on people with holiday homes. The people with holiday homes got very annoyed. They voted themselves into office and they got rid of the additional rate tax. So there are challenges there. One option, of course, is direct government investment in regional housing markets. And that could be through public housing, community sector housing or other mechanisms, or indeed additional support for home ownership in the regions. And the Morrison government obviously took that policy to the last federal election, partly through a house price guarantee as well. I guess the thing we have to realise is that with public housing in particular largely contracting over the last 4 decades, it's very difficult to attract additional investment into regional housing markets by those entities. I currently sit on the board of the South Australian Housing Trust, which is a government housing provider, and everything is driven by where the biggest demand is. So 75% of all South Australians live in Adelaide, so that's where the biggest demand is, and that's where the most pressing need is, and so that's where we provide. And without investment in regional housing, that will never change. But it's a brave government entity that says no to places with greatest needs. A third strategy in terms of direct government investment would be subsidies to new housing providers, for example, off-site manufacturers. There's been a lot of discussion about off-site manufacturing as a solution to regional housing needs, in fact, all housing needs. But there have been a number of problems, one of which has been the nature of the building industry overall, which is something I'll turn to again later, but also governments have been reluctant to subsidise one provider over others. The technology exists, it just hasn't been taken up for reasons that reflect the social and economic context. The other approach that we have seen in terms of governments taking a more direct approach has been in New South Wales, where governments have nominated a limited number of growth centres. So in New South Wales, they nominated 10 centres outside of Sydney, which they wanted to grow. That included places like Wagga Wagga, Tamworth, I think, Bathurst, Orange, etc. And they poured more money and more resources into providing infrastructure in those places so they could grow. And that has provided some housing relief, but it hasn't seen growth in social housing providers as a percentage of the total. Moving on, we look at Australia's current solutions. So the Housing Affordability Future Fund, in talking with Eloise and Murray earlier today, what we saw was, and we were discussing the fact that some of you may have received the outcomes of the first round of announcements in the Housing Affordability Future Fund. When I first developed these slides, essentially they were looking at a relatively modest program with 10,000 dwellings to be announced in the first tranche. My understanding is that the first tranche was announced last night and they allocated 13,000 opportunities for new dwellings to be built. But in Queensland, that comes down to only 1,300 new dwellings to be built through the HAF. And I think in Adelaide it was something like 800. So it's not an enormous number relative to need. It also has some elements to it which make it an unusual form of housing assistance. So essentially it's a loan facility only available on new, previously unoccupied dwellings, but one which is open to participation by state and local governments and also the community sector, which is where some of the organisations participating in this discussion today might be involved. Those who are involved need to commit equity, which is assumed in many instances to be in the form of land, but not all instances. Not only that, properties need to be affordable for at least 25 years, and other capital will need to be raised by the participant. Funds are allocated on a per capita basis across states and territories. So essentially that means New South Wales gets 25%, Victoria gets a third, Queensland gets a bit less than that, Western Australia gets the next. And by the time you get to the ACT, you're looking, well, actually by the time you get to Tasmania, it's 4 dwellings. So it's not a particularly large program. It's also probably not the sort of program that many regional communities with major problems think they need. What they want is someone just to give them a subsidy to build properties. But this isn't what this is, because it requires commitment of equity, and often they struggle to identify what that equity could be. They're also, I think it's fair to say, quite high transaction costs associated with the HAF. You would have to find out about, if you wanted to put in a HAF bid and you're a regional community, you'd have to find out what the scheme is, how you apply, how you get updates. That's all before you start dealing with the government. You'd have to find out what the requirements are. You'd have to line up other finance. You'd have to identify your other finance coming into the project, and you'd have to make sure you've got agreement about where that demand would be met when you build, etc. And that can be done relatively easily. Bearing in mind, it has to have been previously unoccupied dwellings. And when this was first announced, it was felt that a lot of that stock would actually, a lot of the allocations would go into Melbourne and Sydney, where there are apartments currently unoccupied that have been built some time previously. Which is the point I make here. Critically also, there are no specific targets for the regions. And the remote housing stream is likely to be targeted to Aboriginal needs, which is appropriate, but it may suit some regions and may not suit them as well. One of the problems with the HAF is that there are relatively few community housing providers based in and specifically focused on the regions. In South Australia, there's essentially none. They're all branches, if you like, of those headquartered either in Melbourne or Adelaide. In New South Wales, I can think of Housing Plus, which is based out of Orange, and also St George, Compass Housing, which is headquartered in Newcastle. But Newcastle is hardly a small country town. There will be more in Queensland, but even so, they would be relatively small compared to the larger organisations. And my starting assumption has always been the bigger CHPs would deal with this more easily because they have more embedded developed relationships with financiers and better advice available to them. And there's also a tendency, of course, that in some places, state governments who get to vet these proposals, and that's a very important point, state governments get to comment on these proposals, would prioritise their capital cities. So I think the HAF raises some interesting questions. For example, could community housing providers and other not-for-profits and local governments work together in the region to secure HAF funding? Now, I might be teaching you how to suck eggs or telling you to go and suck eggs and you've already done it. But it seems to me that many community housing providers, because of the nature of their business and the arrangements that they operate under with respect to the stock they hold and manage, have limited balance sheets and therefore limited assets. But local governments hold enormous assets. I think they hold something like 80% of all assets held by governments in Australia. Much of that asset is actually in land, and that's an eligible inclusion for financing HAF bids. So can community housing providers and other not-for-profits work with local governments to help put forward HAF bids? The other question is, can community housing providers work with the regions to secure state government prioritisations? That's a really important question. And how would they go about doing that? And how would they make sure that, if at the very least, that regional bids were not adversely assessed when it came to the recommendations put by the state government to the Commonwealth government? And finally, can HAF deliver a volume of housing likely to have a positive impact on housing affordability in the regions? And I think the short answer to that last question is quite simple. It's no, because too little is being provided at the national scale. And even in the smallest regions, the addition of 1 or 2 dwellings would always be welcome, but it may not be path-breaking in terms of the affordability challenge. So HAF, I would suggest, may be part of the solutions, but I don't think it's necessarily the entire solution. And HAF doesn't get over some of the other problems facing the regions, particularly the problems of supply. Without supply, you're not going to build new housing. And I guess one of the risks I see for the HAF is that it may well see a large number of providers receive funding and then they simply can't get the stock built at the price they want in the time frame they're contracted to deliver against. So we've got to think about other issues and other opportunities. I just thought I'd skip past the previous slide and move on to this one first. In the piece of work that Eloise referred to at the beginning when she was introducing me, she talked about in her report, which is completed. And as part of that report, we did a small-scale survey of participants in the house building industry regionally. And we mainly talked to community housing providers and local governments about what they saw in their regional housing market. And for many of the questions like, is planning a problem? Is there a shortage of adequate zone land? The result was, for some people it was, and for some people it wasn't. Many people didn't report the adequacy of land was a problem, or the adequacy of or the time taken to plan for urban development was a problem. But in a couple of areas, there was a consensus that it was a major problem. Now, the first one was the adequacy of the regional building workforce. Big problems in the building workforce. Traditional model of the small scale builder producing 1 or 2 properties a year has died, and probably died with the generation dying out. And also its departure was accelerated by the shift probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when capital city-based builders started moving into the regions of producing housing of good quality and at a price cheaper and quicker, more quickly than the regionally based producers could produce. And that became a big problem. And so the building industry locally disappeared, which meant there was no one being recruited into the workforce in that region. So now we have a major problem with the building workforce and its availability. And the building industry isn't recovering because there have been ups and downs in the cycle of building construction. Moving on, the other major problem has been the cost of materials. Now, this has been a nationwide problem, and this is another one where there was consensus. This has been a nationwide problem, but it has a much more acute impact in regional Australia because incomes are simply lower. And also the cost of production are necessarily higher and the risks of production are higher, so builders are looking for a bigger margin. They can produce more housing more quickly in the capital cities than they can in the regional centres, so they look to go there first, which puts further pressure on building supply in these places. So all that's pretty dire, but there are probably other pathways we can think about in terms of regional housing and how they can be improved. Some of these are potential pathways, I think, for community housing providers. So one of the things that we see in South Australia is that South Australia's Government's Office of Regional Housing, the Renewal SA, has taken on a role of facilitating solutions around adding additional housing in regional centres. Largely doing that through a head leasing model where they lease out 20 properties and they sublease them down to others in that model, other government agencies. But there is scope for community housing providers to get involved in that sort of facilitation model, either as a provider or in emulating that model in terms of head leasing and making it available to those in greatest need. The other thing that I have seen in many instances is non-government agencies acting as facilitators. And this includes community housing providers. So over the last few years, I've participated in the leadership summits or leadership training that Regional Australia Institute organises. And they've been held in some really interesting places. One was in Ngambia in Victoria, and the most recent one was in Launceston in Tasmania. And over the last 2 years, every time we've met, people naturally want to talk about regional housing and what they're doing about it. So in the Darling Downs, which is obviously in your bailiwick, there's a regional organisation of council that is trying to develop a demand aggregation model. I'll talk about demand aggregation more later, so that there's a strategic level of demand in the region to facilitate efficient production of housing, build the workforce over time, make sure there are builders that are viable within the region and develop housing that way. In the Wimmera, there's another economic development agency called Wimmera Development Corporation. They have a similar structure structure similar to the Regional Development Australia Committee. They've been going around the country towns of Victoria in Western Victoria, establishing special purpose vehicles to demolish and rebuild housing for older people. And that they've been very successful in what they've done, but of course, the impact's been limited within their region. But community housing providers have done similar sorts of activities, facilitating and coordinating investment in their regions to bring about positive change. A player that many people don't acknowledge is local government. And about 10 years ago, we did a major piece of work looking at local government and housing in the 21st century. And when we sent a survey to local governments, what we found is local governments in inner city parts of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, etc., were heavily involved and interested in housing. Most suburban local governments had no interest in housing, and then rural and remote local governments had a very strong interest. And many of them expressed their interest through strategic partnerships with community housing organisations. And many of them saw it as part of their community wellbeing mandate that they have in some parts of this country. And that was most acute in the remote regions where, for example, the local government responsible for the Pilbara region has to invest in housing simply to accommodate its own workforce, let alone the workforce working outside of the mines. Just moving on. We move on here. One of the big issues in the regions is regions require low engagement builders and high prices because there's not a sufficient volume of work. So as mentioned before, one of the ways you can overcome this is through a process of demand aggregation. So if one community housing provider wants to put out 3 properties for development over a 10-year timeframe, build construction and development over a 10-year timeframe, that is a one-off job for perhaps one small builder, would not attract the interest of a large builder. If 30 community housing providers or local governments were to put out a tender for the construction of 300 new properties over a 10-year timeframe, or even a 15-year timeframe, and in a known timescale with known cost structures and legal arrangements, that becomes a different proposition in terms of the scale of investment by the local builders. They'll establish and build upon their workforce. They may invest in new equipment and facilities, and they'll invest in training. So demand aggregation is potentially one strategy that can be used by community housing providers in partnership with local government or not, in partnership with state government or not, in partnership with other not-for-profit organisations or not, to actually undertake that role. On my slide there, I asked, how could this be done? Well, the answer is you begin by talking to people. Who should take the lead? Well, anyone can take the lead. Leadership isn't restricted to one category or one class of organisation or individual, but clearly community housing providers have a lot of skin in the game, and they also have subject knowledge that other organisations may lack. What would be the risks? Well, the risks are never taken away, they can only be managed, and the potential upside could look very substantial indeed in terms of having a viable housing future. And one of the things I often like to controversially argue is that in the 21st century, you don't see jobs come into your region and then you build houses for those people. If you build the houses, then the jobs come into the region. And so that's an economic development narrative that governments find incredibly attractive. It's not just about social welfare, it's about building the region's economy. And that applies equally whether you're building for the poorest in the community or for those in the free market. So demand aggregation is one way in which we can think about finding solutions. And I guess my last slide really goes to my broader point around mobilising local leadership. Eloise, in her chat beforehand, talked about how she came from Rockhampton. I'm willing to bet that there are many community housing organisations in Queensland which are based outside of Brisbane. Potentially you are local leaders. You know who the influential people are. You have your own social networks. You have your own ability to shape your future through the investment decisions you make, but also through your ability to create a story about positive change and finding a solution to housing that can be quite impactful. In the study I referred to before with Ahuri, we did have dealings with an organisation who felt the solution was we will do more studies, we'll mobilise people, and then we'll put up a compelling business case to send to the Queensland Government. The Queensland Government effectively took their proposal, said, yeah, you want investment of this much in your region, thank you very much, and they stuck it in the drawer, never to be seen again. I guess one of the things I'd say is those approaches where you're simply asking for something without similar commitments or a mobilising strategy are always going to fail. What you need to be doing is you need to be bringing politicians and other decision makers to see the successes you already have on the ground and get them to be part of that success as well, which is very intoxicating for a politician looking for re-election. So I think thinking about how you lead in this domain, how you use the tools available, for those of you being successful with the HAF round, that's a tool that you can use. For those of you who are going to build 1 or 2 properties anyway in the regions, that's a tool you can use. For those of you who have got strong connections with local government or other key movers and shakers in your region, that's a lever you can use. So that's my suggestion to you. There's a lot to think about. Think beyond the HAF. It's never going to be the solution. Australia's a big country. Queensland's enormous. The demand for housing is enormous. But as not-for-profit organisations, you have a freedom to bring about change, unlike most government agencies. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Gosh, yeah, so much to think about. And some really interesting examples. I'd love to start off the last 5 minutes with a question just more around that example of the Darling Downs one that you briefly mentioned. Is that connected to, I know there's been some work done by the Western Queensland Alliance of Councils on local housing action plans. Was that connected to that, or was that a different example?
But if I remember correctly, and it was a discussion a couple of years ago now, I think it was, if I can put it, a subset of that broader piece of work around Western Queensland. So yes, they were engaged in discussions with that broader alliance around housing action plans, but also they were taking their own measures to solve their own problems. As I understood it, one of the critical problems they had is that their towns are effectively dying, and partly that's been made worse by carbon credit offsets. And they saw that central government wouldn't provide them with solutions and existing policy instruments wouldn't provide them with solutions. They had to find a way for individual councils within their regional organisation to be able to work together within the confines of current expenditure restrictions.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, anyone else who would like to ask a question? We've got 5 minutes left now with Andrew. Or even any thoughts or observations, comments.
Adam, knowing that you're sort of based more regionally, and I think he's just jumped on a phone call. I was just looking at his sort of face a few times throughout the presentation. I wonder sort of what he'd be thinking. But he's on a call, so we might just skip that one and see if anybody else has a question.
Murray, I have a question. It's Tom Nicolai from Good House Partners. We're an advisor to many CHPs, often working in the regions in Queensland, Victoria, and WA. Have you done any work on trying to quantify the disadvantage that regional CHPs face?
In terms of their financial base?
Yes, because at the end of the day, it's all about trying to attract government funding. Mm-hmm. And what we found that sometimes the government may have a target to reach a regional allocation, but it's so much harder to put credible proposals in front of government. So there are always fewer quality proposals in the regions, and government consequently approves few projects in the regions. So the disadvantage is almost like baked into the process.
Yeah, look, I agree with you 100%, Tom. No, I haven't done any work on quantifying that. I have stumbled across it before. Years ago, I did a piece of work on the uptake of NRAS, if you remember that scheme, looking at, and I was doing some work in Lismore, and there was a lot of discussion there. And one of the things that really struck me when I was doing that piece of work is I was talking to local governments in Lismore. I mean, that's a housing market now, isn't it? Local government hadn't heard about the National Rental Affordability Scheme. And so they weren't advocating for it, they weren't pushing it, they weren't expediting it or making it easier for organisations. And in that instance, Lismore actually did get some NRAS funding because there was a not-for-profit based in Sydney that also had a branch in Lismore, and they were allocated some places to go into Lismore. So it was a good outcome, but it was a fairly hit and miss process. And you're right, you know, the necessarily smaller size of regionally based not-for-profits, community housing providers, does put them at a considerable disadvantage, particularly when you begin to deal with these financing instruments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We got a question from Sue. You've just taken yourself off mute.
Yeah, I do have a question. And first of all, can I just say thank you for all of the information that you've just provided in this presentation. It's been quite thought-provoking, and it really resonates with the position that I'm working in at the moment. The question I think I have is, how do you get the attention when you're in a non-politically favourable area, or you don't have that the government in place at the time looking at your area as favourable for building housing? You've got larger businesses, or what we would call a large business within the rural area, that can't keep staff because there's no housing.
Yeah.
And you can't attract anyone because they're saying to you, well, there's not enough people on your housing list, or this current housing list, to indicate that there's a need. But anecdotally, we know that there is a need because people are leaving the area where they can get housing and putting themselves on a list to say, well, we want to live X because we think we can get the housing, but we really like to go back to the rural area in which we grew up in. So I guess throwing all of that into the mix, how do you then sort of attract, some momentum on what you're trying to do within a rural area?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that story is just a bit too common, Sue, in the sense that, if you're in a safe blue seat or a safe red seat, you really struggle to attract the attention of the political parties. Federally, I'm very lucky in that where I live used to be a safe blue seat, and it's been taken, the last election was taken over by Labor for the first time since 1947. So, we're getting a lot of attention at the moment. I think there are a couple of things to think about. One is there are always two narratives you can tell. One is that, the abject level of need that is evident in places that people really do need accommodation. And I think, I'm with you 100%, Sue, in that if the housing was there, people would move back. And of course, if people move back, they then demand goods and services. And if they're demanding more goods and services, those towns become more vibrant, which is the second story you can tell, which is about economic growth. And local governments are always interested in economic growth, and state governments are always interested in economic growth. And if you've got enough of it, and if you're in a marginal enough federal seat, federal governments are interested in economic growth as well, and housing supply. So I think part of your solution needs to be talking to your local government, probably not by yourself, but in coalition with others, about how you can stimulate further growth in your region, further prosperity in your region, by having support to get more housing. And it doesn't, in the smallest parts of Australia, it doesn't need to be much to do much. So in the study I referred to before, there's a small town in South Australia in the wheat belt called Corinda. It's really only 90 minutes from Adelaide, but it feels like it's 4 hours. And their goal is to build one new house at a time. They've only got 750 people, and their local government builds one new house at a time. And even the most modest commitment can bring about positive change. And that's the sort of discussions I would encourage you to have. And if your region has got local governments acting there, which clearly they do, has community housing providers active there, which clearly they do, that's a big step up to having really positive benefits.
Thank you. That's given me some food for thought.
Good, thank you, Sue.
Thanks. Great question, Sue. So we've come to the end of our time, but if anyone has any final burning questions, feel free to ask.
Well,
Okay.
also too, Andrew, if you're happy for us to send these slides out after, it'd be really handy, as well as the recording will be up. So you might get the odd sort of email or touch base from somebody to Andrew, if that's okay.
That's fine, of course. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Andrew. It's been really, really insightful and just so great, I think, to focus on the regions. And yeah, thanks everyone for your insightful questions, and hope to see you at the next Filling the Pulse session.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.